In 1940, Adolf Hitler's troops were on the way to conquering the whole of Europe. The Wehrmacht invaded first Austria and Czechoslovakia, then Poland, Norway, Denmark, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Now, they were marching on France. Hitler seemed invincible. Only Churchill dared confront him. He was the only one to stand up to him. As the recently appointed Prime Minister of Great Britain, he had one plan: war and victory at any price.
We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall never surrender.
All through the long fight, he would wage war from the front line and support his people with all his force. His fierce resistance would change the course of history. He was the last bastion. Throughout the war, he gathered allies to him and led the battle. But where did he get his formidable powers of persuasion? His will to win at all costs? I felt as if my past life had been but a preparation for this hour and for this trial, he says in his memoirs. Winston indeed seemed all his life to have been preparing for that dreadful hour. In 1940, he was 65 years old, Prime Minister of Britain, and already the stuff of legends. But behind the legend, who was this great and complex man? Everything thus far would indicate that he was the one and only man capable of saving the free world. Winston Churchill was born into one of England's most celebrated families. It was his ancestor, the Duke of Marlborough, who in 1704 defeated the troops of Louis XIV and was given Blenheim Palace as his reward. And it is in that 320-room palace worthy of Versailles that Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill is born in November 1874. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, is a brilliant, fiery and unpredictable politician, a member of the Conservative Party, but who supports liberal reforms. His American mother, Jenny Jerome, is a beautiful and flighty socialite whose many lovers, often titled men, include the future King of England, Edward VII. This future architect of the 20th century is nicknamed the Little Bulldog. At school, he's wild and unruly. His school reports speak for themselves. Number of times late, 20. Very disgraceful, very bad. General conduct, very bad. Is a constant trouble to everybody and is always in some scrape or other. He has no ambition. Like all good sons of the British aristocracy, the young Winston is sent off to boarding school. There, the young troublemaker and scrapper has a hard time. "My dear Mamma," he writes home, "do attend to my letter. I am so wretched. Even now I weep. I'm so very unhappy. Please, do come to see your loving son." But the Churchills are too busy with socializing and garden parties. Winston receives no more than one visit per year. Despite this lack of affection, Winston at 12 years old greatly admires his father. He learns all his speeches by heart and fills endless albums with articles and cartoons about him. But in December 1886, Lord Randolph, recently promoted to Chancellor of the Exchequer, takes a huge gamble. He resigns over criticisms of his budget, hoping to be supported by public opinion and bring about the downfall of the government. It is a dismal failure. He is simply replaced and completely sidelined. Although he continues to sit in Parliament, his political career is over. This mistake does not improve relations between father and son. Lord Randolph never misses an opportunity to belittle Winston. He already considers him a failure. Convinced that Winston will never succeed in life, Lord Randolph guides him towards a military career. Yet by doing so, he unwittingly gives his son the opportunity to show what he is really made of. Action is what he has been needing. Winston distinguishes himself in every field, as a horseman, a marksman, and a swordsman. You see, I'm not a good-for-nothing, he seems to be telling his father. One day I'll be there with you, on the benches in Parliament. It's a wonderful dream, but one that will end when his father dies ravaged by syphilis at the young age of 46, having never truly loved or acknowledged his son. From that day on, Winston is a man on a mission. He's in a hurry. To do what, he's not yet sure, but surely to accomplish something before death takes him, perhaps too soon as well. He may have been an unworthy son, but now he will strive to become an illustrious descendant of those ancestors, the Marlboroughs, the saviors of England. So, as his tears of grief dry, Winston seeks his baptism of fire. He travels throughout the British Empire, seeking out wars and rebellions, enlisting on all the fronts. Cuba, India, the Sudan, where he takes part in the last cavalry charge in British history. He'd rather have a heroic death than be a nobody. And if he survives, he will make a name for himself the equal of his fathers, if not greater. It is during these wars that Winston really becomes Churchill. He develops a lifelong taste for the four intoxicants of danger, alcohol, cigars, and writing. On every battlefield, the soldier now doubles up as a prolific war correspondent. His dozens of articles from every front will make his name and his reputation. War is raging in South Africa, so he rushes off there. With fearless heroism, he saves the crew of an armored train. He is taken prisoner. He escapes. A price is put on his head, £25, dead or alive. After 3 weeks of wandering, he manages secretly to hop a freight train and arrives back at base in triumph. In 1900, the injured are all being evacuated to England. Winston arrives home without a scratch. 5 years of war and 3 books telling of his campaigns have made him a hero in defense of the empire. This hard-won notoriety will allow him to realize his dream of entering Parliament to sit beside the ghost of his father. At age 26, he is elected under the Conservative Party banner. Churchill's political career is meteoric. He fiercely defends his ideas and has no hesitation in leaving the Conservative Party to join the Liberals. He is reviled by the Conservatives, who call him the Blenheim Rat for his betrayal. Churchill, though, takes no heed. At 32 years old, he enters government as its youngest member for half a century. With all this political success, Winston completely forgets his personal life. His mother, though, won't let matters rest. He becomes engaged to Clementine Hosier, a Scottish aristocrat 10 years his junior. The wedding is held in Westminster. It's the toast of London, with 1,500 guests. Summing up his life with the woman who gave him 5 children, Winston will one day write, "I married and lived happily ever afterwards." He's happy in his political life too. Ministerial positions follow one after another, until at just 36 years old, he is appointed Home Secretary. He's impossible to pin down. A liberal among the conservatives, he's now a conservative among liberals, not hesitating to stare down strikers or arrest suffragettes. But it is in 1911 that the English discover just how determined and intransigent Winston truly is. In London, 3 policemen have been killed in an ambush. The killers, anarchists, are cornered in a building in Sydney Street, where a crowd has begun to gather. Until this moment, no Home Secretary has ever gone into the field. Winston, informed of the situation while in his bath, rushes to the scene. Danger and the smell of gun smoke hold a terrible fascination for him. The news media of the day tell of the zeal of the young minister, who heads straight for the front line at the risk of his own life. After several hours of the siege, keen to be done with the matter, he orders the building to be burnt to the ground. Churchill won't allow the fire brigade access, so the insurgents die, burned alive in the blaze. Photos of the minister are on every front page. His opponents seize the opportunity to present him as an irresponsible adventurer, a reputation that will stick. To one of his colleagues who reproaches him for going to the scene, he replies, "Don't be cross, it was such fun." Britain's premier policeman is a soldier and will remain so all his life. He gives his all to the creation of the British Secret Service. He regularly attends military maneuvers, including those of the German army in the company of Kaiser Wilhelm II, a leader whose expansionist ambitions are becoming more obvious with each passing week. For Churchill, there is no doubt, Germany is striding towards war. He convinces the Prime Minister to appoint him First Lord of the Admiralty, responsible for the British Navy. For Winston, this is a great honor. On board the Admiralty yacht that is now his floating office, he throws himself heart and soul into his work. He makes ready the fleet for a German attack, modernizing it and launching new warships. He's constantly innovating. Being First Lord of the Admiralty does not curb his interest in aviation, and he immediately sees its military potential. His reforms will result in the creation of the Royal Naval Air Force. These innovations are all expensive. But Churchill defends his spending so eloquently that in March 1914, MPs vote in the most significant naval budget in British history. They won't regret it. When war breaks out, in August 1914, the British fleet is ready. The First World War is a war of positions. The armies face each other along hundreds of kilometers of trenches made up of mud and the tens of thousands of dead. For Churchill, holding back and doing nothing is simply inconceivable. He wants to move the front, create a new one, take Germany by surprise by cutting it off from its ally, the Ottoman Empire. And that means crossing the Dardanelles Strait, the only access route to Constantinople. But the Turkish defenses have been underestimated. Throughout 1915, all attempts to land in the Dardanelles will be miserable failures, and evacuating the Allied troops will be a bloodbath. It ends with 100,000 Allied dead and 150,000 casualties. It is for Britain one of the greatest disasters of the First World War. A disaster for which the politicians want Churchill to pay the price. The Conservatives have not forgotten their betrayal by the Blenheim rat, and now they want his head. Rejected all round, he is forced to resign. And the mighty Churchill has a long way to fall. Like his father, Lord Randolph, 30 years ago, the heir to the Marlboroughs has failed. Left with nothing to do, he plunges into a terrible period of depression. He calls it his black dog. For the first time in his life, Winston can see no future for himself. After 15 years of continuous political ascent, everything has fallen apart. The former minister, soldier, writer, and MP will drown his sorrows in drink, tobacco, and an unexpected new pastime, painting. But Churchill is consumed by the need for action. Now 40 years old, he gets himself assigned to the command of a Scottish battalion fighting in Flanders. Within 6 months, Winston has got his old energy back. He returns to London, where publication of the Dardanelles report restores his spirits. He is finally appointed Minister of Munitions. In 1917, he equips the 500,000 American soldiers who land in Europe, and has thousands of tanks built. These are the tanks he dreamed of when he was the First Lord of the Admiralty. He built their prototypes back in the naval yards. In August 1918, they break through the front and penetrate to 400 kilometers behind German lines. It's the beginning of the end for the Kaiser's army. It's also a personal triumph for Winston, one that allows him, at least temporarily, to forget the shame of the Dardanelles. 3 months later, in November 1918, the armistice is at last signed. Churchill will hold a succession of ministerial posts, war, aviation, the colonies, until fate and the vagaries of politics clip his wings. Winston is overtaken by events. First, his youngest daughter, Marigold, dies, following a sudden onset of meningitis. Although still grieving for his daughter, Winston is faced with a new election campaign. He is prevented from taking part by an attack of appendicitis. Now, the only card he has left to play is his carefully tended public image. He has himself taken to vote in a wheelchair, yet even this does not prevent him losing the election. Much later, he will write, "In the twinkling of an eye, I found myself without an office, without a seat, without a party, and without an appendix." The blows come thick and fast, but Winston will rise above them. 2 years after he leaves the government, the Conservatives offer him a constituency and a portfolio, Chancellor of the Exchequer, like his father 30 years ago. Despite his earlier betrayal, Churchill returns to the bosom of the Conservative Party. He remarks, "Anyone can rat, but it takes a certain amount of ingenuity to re-rat." Appointing Winston is a way for the Conservatives to neutralize him. He's so brilliant that it's better he be in the government than on the outside, free to undermine any initiative that does not please him. It's now 1925, and Churchill, the human whirlwind, has been in politics for a quarter of a century. He has become an orator without equal, daring to address Parliament in ways that make more than one MP shrink in his presence. One day, the MP, Lady Astor, spits at him, "If I were your wife, I'd poison your coffee," to which Churchill replies, "Madam, if I were your husband, I'd drink it." But Winston is a very poor chancellor, and the crisis of 1929 sweeps the government out of power. Winston loses his ministry. The Conservatives hold him responsible for the defeat. Once again, he's a leper in his own party. Churchill is completely isolated. Nobody has forgotten his intransigence in Sydney Street, his inconsistency in the Dardanelles, and his turncoat behavior. Along with his support for King Edward VIII, who wants to marry a commoner, it all makes him the country's most unpopular MP. Everyone, even his own family, agrees that his political career is behind him. And yet, like a drowning man who has to hit bottom before he can come back up, Churchill uses the last of his strength to make himself heard again. Alone among the entire British political class, he warns Parliament of the danger of Hitler's rise to power and the illusion of pacifism. He is one of the only MPs to criticize the Munich Agreement, signed by Paris and London, which hands over to Hitler a part of Czechoslovakia in exchange for a mere scrap of paper. But Churchill's words of warning go unheard. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returns from Munich triumphant.
Some of you perhaps have already heard what it contains. We regard the agreement signed last night and the Anglo-German naval agreement as symbolic of the desire of our two peoples never to go to war with one another again.
God bless you, Mr. Chamberlain. You know we're all with you. And when we shout, God bless you, Mr. Chamberlain.
For the English, Chamberlain is the hero who has kept the peace. Six months later, in March 1939, German troops marching into Prague swiftly put paid to any remaining pacifist illusions. The Munich Agreement is now invalid. Churchill was right. Gradually, public opinion shifts. The newspapers announce, "We need Churchill." When, 6 months later, in September 1939, Hitler invades Poland, France and Britain finally enter the war. Chamberlain offers Churchill his old post of First Lord of the Admiralty. For most men, war is a disaster, but in Churchill it awakens a passion. At age 65, he is full of energy. The bulldog has become a lion. His fellow ministers may be cursing their excitable colleague, but they're forced to hide their resentment. Winston is untouchable, the government's one true soldier. Chamberlain proves to be a disastrous wartime prime minister, and he pays the price for it.
Goodbye, Mr. Chamberlain, and thanks for all you've tried to do. We welcome the new Prime Minister, Mr. Churchill.
On May the 10th, 1940, the very day that Hitler launches his attacks on Belgium and Holland, Churchill finally takes up the position he has always dreamed of. This, he understandably feels, is the moment he has been living for. The Royal Air Force, on which Britain now pins all her hopes, was pioneered by him back in 1912, and he has watched jealously over it ever since. The hundreds of tanks that now await the land invasion, it was he who upgraded them all in 1915. MI6, now in intense preparation for the invasion, was created 32 years ago while he was Home Secretary. And most of all, the Royal Navy's new ships were built by him as First Lord of the Admiralty between 1911 and 1915. For Winston Churchill, the war that has just been declared is a personal matter and the high point of his career. The new Prime Minister's main weapon, though, is not made of iron or steel, but of spirit. It's the remarkable eloquence he has sharpened over the last 40 years. Winston will find the words to awaken the British people and give them the courage to stand brave against all odds.
I would say to the House, as I said to those who have joined the government, I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. We have before us an ordeal of the most grievous kind. We have before us many, many long months of struggle and of suffering. You ask, what is our policy? I will say, it is to wage war by sea, land, and air, with all our might and with all the strength that God can give us, to wage war against a monstrous tyranny never surpassed in the dark and lamentable catalogue of human crime. That is our policy. You ask, what is our aim? I can answer in one word: victory. Victory at all costs. Victory in spite of all terror. Victory however long and hard the road may be.
Listening to him, even the opposition are in tears. The British people are torn between fear and defeatism and the will to survive. The courage was there, but it had to be brought to the surface, and that's what Churchill has done. Yet on that first evening, the new Prime Minister has his doubts. Greeted by a crowd shouting, "Good luck, Winnie, God bless you." Once in private, he breaks down in tears and confides to one of his generals, "Poor people. They trust me, and I can give them nothing but disaster for quite a long time." The disaster arrives quicker than expected. Churchill is counting on France and its formidable army, but after 6 weeks of fighting, it collapses. England is alone against the greatest war machine Europe has ever known. The situation seems so hopeless that some ministers are considering negotiating with Hitler. Churchill categorically refuses to do so. He'd rather die sword in hand. In the summer of 1940, the Battle of Britain begins. Hitler wants to invade the British Isles, but to do so, he must first gain control of the skies. Hundreds of German bombers, escorted by Luftwaffe fighters, start pounding all military targets in southern England. A fierce battle for the skies ensues between the German Messerschmitts on one side and British Spitfires and Hurricanes on the other. The sky of Britain is aglow. Yet despite the pilots' bravery, within a fortnight, the Royal Air Force is near to losing control of England's southern airspace. A fortuitous event changes the course of destiny. On August the 24th, a German pilot commits a navigational error and drops his bombs on the outskirts of London. For Churchill, this is provocation. He orders the bombing of Berlin to start the next day. His generals try to dissuade him. Berlin, they say, is too far away. But Churchill is determined, and now he's angry. Most of the planes are shot down or forced to turn around. Only a handful of pilots somehow manage to drop bombs on the outskirts of Berlin. It's a risky operation and has totally unexpected consequences. Hitler cracks. Berlin bombed? He will not tolerate it. In his fury, Hitler orders his air force to burn London and all major British cities to the ground. The operation is named Blitz Lightning. Hitler is convinced England will be on its knees within a few days. But despite the rain of fire that strikes the city, the apocalyptic scenes the population must live through, and the tens of thousands dead, London survives. Throughout the Blitz, Churchill is constantly on the move, keeping morale up in the worst-hit areas. The English are all behind him and beside him. Hitler was convinced that the morale of the British would collapse as well as that of their leader. Not at all. The English and their leader are of one accord. Churchill's firmness, his imperturbable dignity, his unwavering faith in the future, his conviction that England will triumph, along with his smile, his hat, his cigar, and his fiery speeches, all at this moment in history make him a symbol of resistance against tyranny.
We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
At this point, England is Churchill, and Churchill is England. In unleashing his destructive madness, Hitler has made a terrible mistake. His air force is turned away from military targets. As civilians withstand the Blitz, Churchill reorganizes the RAF, gets his airfields back in order, and encourages his airmen to renew their attacks. They cause carnage among the enemy. The United Kingdom will not be overrun. England has not lost the war, but the question now is how to win it. For Churchill, the answer is simple. Bring in the United States. On December the 7th, 1941, the US base at Pearl Harbor in the Pacific is attacked by the Japanese. America is at war. 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor, Winston is in the United States. He has to convince the American Congress not to leave the European battlefield and to continue to support Britain. It is one of the most important speeches of his life.
Members of the Senate, Prime Minister of Great Britain, the Right Honourable Winston.
On the 26th of December 1941, masterfully combining humor, eloquence, and determination, the master wordsmith surpasses himself.
That if my father had been American and my mother British, instead of the other way around, I might have got here on my own. What kind of a people do they think we are? Is it possible they do not realize that we shall never cease to persevere against them until they have been taught a lesson which they and the world will never forget?
The speech is a success, but the pressure has been intense and Winston's not getting any younger. After a long meeting with Roosevelt, he feels a sharp pain in his left arm. He is having a heart attack. He begs his doctor, "You're not going to tell me to rest? I can't. I won't. Nobody else can do this job. I must. You mustn't say anything. At this moment, as we join forces with the United States, Britain cannot be seen with a prime minister with a weak heart. Everything must remain secret." After a few days of forced rest, the old lion is back in his usual top shape. At 67, he sleeps 4 hours a night, keeps a tight schedule of appointments, meetings, and inspections, always in the thick of the Allied war preparations of Allied strategy, while continuing to drink and smoke more than his fair share. He has, in fact, never been happier. His depression is a thing of the past. He's in the limelight, and he's going to play it to the hilt. When an assistant asks if he can have a weekend off, Winston scolds him, "A leave? But don't you like this war?" These images of a man and of a people united and confident seem to promise a victory that still looks a long way off. Everywhere, on all fronts, the Allies are suffering terrible defeats. In Singapore, in February 42, 100,000 English fighters are taken prisoner by the Japanese, the biggest surrender in UK military history. But despite all the losses and the drama, Churchill never stops believing in victory. Now, in a repeat of 1915, he wants to surprise Germany and Italy from the rear. Indefatigable, he manages to convince Stalin and Roosevelt to order a landing in North Africa, an operation dubbed Torch. On November the 8th, 1942, English and American troops land in Oran, Algiers, and Casablanca. Operation Torch is a success. Churchill can breathe again. The scent of victory is finally in the air.
This is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end. But it is perhaps the end of the beginning.
But as Winston announces the end of the beginning, it is for him the beginning of his decline. In 1943, Allied military successes are on the increase. Yet despite Churchill's heroic tours of the battlefields, it is Roosevelt who is now taking charge. And when the three leaders meet in Tehran in November 1943, Churchill is painfully aware of his weakness. Between Stalin, who is holding off nearly 200 German divisions on the battlefield, and Roosevelt, the great provider of arms and equipments, he's not punching at the same weight. "I realized at Tehran what a small nation we are," he will write. "There I sat with the great Russian bear on one side, and on the other the great American buffalo. Between the two sat the poor little English donkey, who was the only one who knew the right way home." He was the bulldog, the old lion. Now he compares himself to a donkey. Depression is not far off. But the war is not over, and he has to keep going. Total victory is not yet assured, but the Allied landing in Normandy on June the 6th, 1944, is indeed the beginning of the end. Still intoxicated by the smell of gunpowder, Winston dreams of being there in the front line, but the king has forbidden it. The war is not yet over, and the old lion is irreplaceable. Only 6 days after D-Day can he at last visit the battlefield.
Winston Churchill now came himself onto the soil of Normandy. The visit was brief. It didn't take long for the Prime Minister to satisfy himself that all goes well on the first stage of the assault of Europe. The Prime Minister and his party returned to the destroyer Kelvin in complete confidence of still greater successes to come. The architects of victory returned home.
By the end of 1944, the Nazi armies are in retreat. Now that the end is near, Churchill is already preparing for the post-war period. If he wants to limit the communist expansion, he must now negotiate with Stalin. "I have discovered," he says, "that I can talk to him man to man, and I'm sure he'll be reasonable." So when, in October 44, he slips Stalin a piece of paper with percentages scribbled on it, he may or may not be bluffing. The figures represent the future division of power in Europe. In fact, they're completely fanciful. How else to account for 10% British influence in Romania and 25% in Bulgaria, where the Soviets reign supreme and the British don't even have any access? Churchill obtains 90% influence in Greece. Stalin ticks the document and hands it back. Churchill comes back from Moscow with this scrap of paper in his pocket, as delighted as Chamberlain coming back from Munich. In fact, he's been taken for a fool. Four months later, in February 1945, Winston, the only man said to travel with more hat boxes than his wife, attends the Yalta Conference. The indefatigable septuagenarian is still trying to control the insatiable greed of Stalin, who is making vague promises of democratic elections in Central Europe. These promises are mere castles in the sand, but Churchill can obtain no more. As for Roosevelt, he's sick, weak, and credulous, and ready to make any concession. And the sandcastles will soon be destroyed by the red wave that engulfs Eastern Europe. On May the 8th, 1945, Nazi Germany finally surrenders. Although elderly and infirm, Churchill has always stood solid as a rock and convinced his people that victory would be his. The whole of Britain applauds him.
This is your victory. Victory of the cause of freedom is every day. In all our long history, we have never seen a greater day than this.
For 5 years, Churchill has never stopped making history. And strangely enough, they've been happy years, which, despite the constant overwork, have kept him from depression. The return to normality is brutal. Parliament is dissolved, and after leading an international coalition and becoming a figure of world renown, the old lion must now run for re-election.
We're going to win. I can feel it in my bones. We're going to win. I ask you to give me a chance to finish this job.
Despite the immense gratitude the British people feel towards him, they're dubious of the old warrior's ability to manage the peace. The man who won the war has lost the election. Churchill is extremely depressed, and inevitably his black dog starts barking louder than ever. "I can't school myself to do nothing for the rest of my life," he says. But the former Cavalier of the 4th Hussars saddles up again and picks up where he left off. The cigars and brandy, new writing, and his one true muse, painting. He will, once again, find a way to influence history. Invited by President Truman in March 1946 to speak at Missouri's Fulton University, Winston, no longer a player on the world stage, proclaims aloud what is being whispered in the corridors of power, that Soviet expansionism represents a new mortal threat to democracy.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent.
This speech, which marks the beginning of the Cold War, rings out across the century. But Winston has not simply exposed the problem, he is also proposing a solution. To deal with Soviet expansionism, the only course of action is to unify those European countries that have escaped its clutches. In Zurich, The Hague, and Strasbourg, he defends the same credo: the United States of Europe, whose Franco-German partnership will be the cornerstone of a European Council. It is an extraordinary vision, and one that has since come true.
Messieurs et mesdames, prenez garde. Je vais parler Français.
He has been a soldier, a minister, a writer, a journalist, an MP, and a painter. Now he is a prophet. And in 1951, at the age of 76, he is once again appointed Prime Minister. The old warrior, never so happy as on the battlefield, has now become a pacifist, with the audacious objective of, in one last magnificent gesture, calming the Cold War. But Russia and the US couldn't care less about the Prime Minister of a Britain now stripped of much of its empire and downgraded to a secondary power. And this, Winston simply cannot accept. However, the man is a living legend. He's honored throughout the whole world. Knighted by the Queen of England, awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1953, he shines wherever he goes. He doesn't resign until April 1955.
On April the 4th, an epoch in British history ended with the resignation of Sir Winston Churchill as Prime Minister. The man who in 1940 had said that he had nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears and sweat, has paid his part of the bargain in full.
All that remains is for Winston to deliver his final victory, the most difficult and the most bitter, his resignation. "I feel like an airplane at the end of its flight," he says, "in the dusk, with the petrol running out, in search of a safe landing." A page of England's history has turned. The last 10 years of his life are divided between his country house, long stays on the Riviera or the Onassis yacht, and even at the house of Marshal Tito. He writes, paints, smokes his cigars, and drinks. These are difficult and painful years. Winston suffers from hip fractures, pneumonia, and several strokes. They're years of long agony. Little by little, he's losing the greatest battle. Each hurried return to England for health reasons. Each time he is released from hospital, and every birthday is the occasion for much, mostly unwanted, public attention. Churchill stops painting for good. Idleness opens the door wide to his black dog, the faithful depression that will always return to its master. In the twilight of his life, he feels it has all been futile. He wanted a strong Britain and a world at peace, and he has ended up with neither. On January the 10th, 1965, he is hit by a massive stroke. He loses consciousness and falls into a coma. When his secretary, John Colville, is asked if the moment is nigh, he replies, he won't die quite yet, not until the 24th of January. Because he always said he would die on the day of his father's death, and I'm certain he will do just that. 2 weeks later, on January the 24th, 70 years to the month, day, and hour after the death of his father, Winston Churchill passes away. Even his death then seemed like a last cry to the one who had so despised him and whose love he so craved. Was this perhaps the key to the Churchill enigma? In the end, did all the qualities of this exceptional man derive from the same source? Warrior. It was his father who made a soldier of him when he was 20 years old. Speaker. It was by listening to his father's speeches and devouring all the newspaper articles on him that Winston learned to love politics. Man of ambition. He was driven to succeed where his father had failed and restore the shine to the family crest. Churchill never sat next to him in Parliament as he had dreamed of doing, but his father's ghost was there throughout his entire career, staring sternly down on him. If only Lord Randolph had seen Winston in the summer of 1940, when he changed the course of history. He might then have admitted he'd been wrong about the boy, and had finally to accept him into the Marlborough clan. It was an old Battle of Britain-class steam locomotive that hauled the funeral train carrying the remains of the old Lion to his final resting place, the small cemetery of Blaydon, where he would lie next to his father, Randolph. It's only just over a mile from Blenheim Castle, where Winston Churchill was born 90 years earlier. He took almost a century to travel a mile. Yet on the way, he changed the fate of England and the world.